So let's preview the Big Ten right now with the man that does a great job on NBC. That is former Ohio State Buckeye linebacker and Josh Perry, kind enough to join us right now. Josh, appreciate it as always. How you been, my man?
I'm doing well. Great to catch up with you. I know I missed you last week. Wanted to get you some action from Big Ten Media Days, but excited to chop it up today.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me start you off with your alma mater, Ohio State. We know that they put up very good regular season records, but as you know, you were defined at that school by if you beat Michigan. They haven't beat Michigan in the last 3 seasons. We know Harbaugh out, Sharon Moore now the head coach at Michigan. But when you look at Ryan Day, only 8 losses in his tenure at The Ohio State. But there are questions now about his job security. Do you feel like Day is on the hot seat, or is that talk a bit premature and ridiculous?
It's the most interesting thing for me to try to forecast. I'll answer by saying yes, but I don't necessarily think it's fair. Ryan Day, you mentioned the Big Ten record, but the losses to Michigan, the record in the postseason, these are the things that people are concerned with at Ohio State because you want to win all of the big games, so I totally get that. There's also a new university president and a new athletic director at The Ohio State University. These are people who did not hire Ryan Day, so I'm sure he's got a bit of a shorter leash with them than he did with the previous administration. That's to be expected. My biggest issue is I understand the desire to win championships, and I do think it's a given that you have to beat your rival. I also come from an era where the coach that I played for, that's all he did, and Tressel had a phenomenal record against Michigan. I think people kind of forgot the days of when it was a reality that you could lose to Michigan. If you run from Ryan Day, who are you going to hire? Like, that's the thing that I keep coming back to when we have these conversations about, is Ryan Day on the hot seat? Sure he is. Who are you going to hire? Like, tell me who's on the short list of guys to come to Ohio State, because you're not going to find coaches with a better resume overall. You're not going to find coaches that have a better track record in the postseason when it comes to the big games that aren't already at premier brands, right? So to me, it becomes really difficult to try to see who would fit there for the Buckeyes, and that's my biggest obstacle to it. I don't like running away from things. I like running to things, and it doesn't seem like there's that natural thing to run to if you're an Ohio State fan trying to replace Ryan Day.
It's a good point that you bring up, and it's totally fair. I'm just wondering, though, like if they lose to Michigan this year with Harbaugh no longer being the head coach of that program, with him off to the NFL with the Chargers, like, is that it for Ryan Day? Because you lose to Michigan this year. I don't get, even though he's only had 8 losses in his career, how they defend Ryan Day as the head football coach, even though, like what you're saying, who else are you really bringing in?
No, I think that's the best point there. It would be indefensible. You're looking at a Michigan team that has 1 returning starter on offense. I do think they're going to be a very good defensive team, but there's a huge quarterback question. I mean, Kirk Campbell, OC, said, hey, we're going to go oldest to youngest on our depth chart. That's how we're going to start off fall camp. And it's like, you had all spring to evaluate the guys, and the best thing that you could come up with was oldest to youngest to see what your quarterback depth chart looks like. I mean, that's what you're up against when you're looking at Michigan right now. It's not the national title version from last year. I do think it's going to be a different team. I think they're going to be good, but I think it's going to be very different. So if you lose 4 in a row to a team that had, as much returning or as little returning production as anybody in college football, I don't know how you start to defend that. I know former players are certainly going to be talking. I know that the fans are going to be all over social media, and it's really difficult to reconcile at that point.
And we kind of just saw with Alabama opening up. Now, they got Kalen DeBoer, which I think is a home run hire. But, I don't think Dan Lanning is leaving Oregon for Ohio State. Sark's not leaving Texas for Ohio State. So it becomes fascinating on who they would bring in. You know what? Some people may call me crazy, and I know it's very complicated there. Would there be any chance that they say, hey, Urban, you want your job back at Ohio State?
I think it would be the most difficult thing. Like, do I think they would back channel and see if he has any interest? I wouldn't put it past anybody to do that. And quite frankly, I don't think it would be a bad idea. I think you would kind of have to. I don't know how interested he would be to get back into college football in the state that we're in with transfer portal and NIL. all those other things. I do think university-wise, too, you're going to have to really try to figure out from a PR standpoint how you deal with that. But like it's the biggest question. Like we could go through names. You mentioned Dan Lanning, Sark. I don't think he would go. Marcus Freeman always felt like one that would be super interesting, but Notre Dame is another one of those brands, and also his record is. I mean, Ryan Day's beat him the last 2 years, right? Like, can you bring that guy in to replace Ryan Day? Like, it's a really tough spot, I think, if you're trying to figure out what the short list looks like for OSU.
And here's the other thing that surprised me with Urban Meyer, because usually, right, the former coach that knows the current coach and they work together doesn't put a lot of pressure on the current coach. When he said a few weeks ago, Ohio State maybe is one of the most talented rosters maybe ever, I was like, first off, this is a very talented roster. There's a big question, though, at the quarterback, so I disagreed with the comment if you want to say it's the most talented roster ever. But I'm like, wow, that's not only Urban Meyer, but then Jim Tressel putting a lot of pressure on Ryan Day.
So it's funny that you say about the quarterback because, like, the quarterbacks that I played with, we had JT Barrett, phenomenal leader, like tough, super gritty dude, but he certainly was not CJ Stroud or like Justin Fields or Dwayne Haskins, right? Like not a first round pick. Same thing with Cardale Jones. So I don't think Urban even gives a damn about the quarterback when he's evaluating what the rest of the talent looks like. I said the same thing. I was like, it is, and you have to understand about Urban, he's the most hyperbolic person that you can ever talk to. He thinks everything is the best ever or the worst ever, and there's not a lot of in between with him. And so I do think part of this is hyperbole, but I think it echoes a lot of the sentiment of what people who view the game believe about this Ohio State roster. The shocking one for me really was Tressel. And I know that Jim Tressel has been invited back into that athletic department. He's been around practice. He's gotten really close with Ryan Day. They shared a ton with him just about, his approach, in particular, his approach with the rivalry and everything. And it feels like you're putting your guy in a real precarious spot because you got two coaches, both won national titles, both were very good against Michigan. Talking about Ryan Day, hasn't been great.
Seems like they're
Michigan,
frustrated.
Does not have the title yet.
That's the way I took it. It seems like they're frustrated, and they're like, okay, Ryan, time to get it back to where it was supposed to be.
I think that's the only thing that makes sense at that point, especially Ryan and Urban having that relationship. It does feel like he put him in a tough spot.
Can Ohio State win the national championship this year with the uncertainty at the quarterback position? Like, it's going to be Will Howard, but we got to see what Will Howard's going to be.
Yes, I think they can. Now, I think it would be very difficult, and I think that a lot of other things are going to have to be as advertised. I think they're going to have the best defense in the country. I think that is a possibility. Caleb Downs in that secondary, they say he's a coach on the football field. From day one, he's been an impact. Lathan Ransom, very veteran guy, wanted to come back. Jack Sawyer, JT on that defensive line. The linebacker room, probably the biggest question, but they're moving Sonny Styles to linebacker. CJ Hicks getting more reps. Cody Simon, a fifth-year guy who wanted to come back, wanted to beat Michigan, wanted to win a championship. I think they're going to be really good on defense. Best running back room in the country.
Yeah.
Probably top 3, top 5 wide receiver room in the country. And I think it is a deeper offensive line than people give it credit for. And I actually like what the left side of that line looks like. So from left tackle to center, I think the two spots on the right side, they're going to have to get figured out here in camp. If all of those positions play the way that they're supposed to, I think it becomes very much listen, get it to the wide receiver that's open. It's okay to check it down. You're a mobile quarterback, so if you feel like you need to run the football. Just don't make the mistakes that lose football games. And if you can do that, I think they can go out there and win them.
Josh Perry here with us. Let's talk about Oregon, who I think right now is the third best team in the country entering this season. I'm fascinated to see what Dylan Gabriel does because I know Bo Nix had 2 incredible years, but Bo Nix walked in to Eugene being an up-and-down player. I never thought he'd put together 2 seasons that we just saw. Like, Dylan Gabriel has been good in multiple spots. I think he's the perfect replacement for Bo Nix.
Yeah, I'm super intrigued, too. The way Dan Lanning talks about Dylan Gabriel is what excites me about him. He's a guy who comes in, immediately becomes a connector with this team, gets to know all the players. They're throwing the football. He's taking them out outside of football. He's getting to know the rest of the coaching staff, the support staff, like taking those guys out too, which when you're the quarterback, you have the luxury of doing that now because you're making more NIL money than anybody. So it's probably the right thing to do. But he does the right things like he's a professional guy, which I love to hear. I knew this from watching the tape, but when I saw him at Big Ten Media Days, I was taken aback a little bit by the stature. He's not a big guy, but he's a gamer, and we know this. And I think he's going to be throwing to what will probably be the best wide receiver group in college football this year. Dan Lanning, to me, has a little bit of that Ryan Day to his game. And what I mean by that is the big games, has not had a ton of success, doesn't have the conference championship yet, has a bad record. I think it's 1-4 against his rivals. This is a huge year for him, I think, in terms of narrative and kind of what we decide we think the next couple years are supposed to look like. He's put it together, though, in terms of the recruiting and in terms of the program building and in terms of how he resources his players to feel like they can operate at their best when it comes to game day. And I think it's going to translate very easily into the Big Ten.
Josh Perry here with us, talking about not being able to win a big game. I know he has a conference championship, but James Franklin at Penn State. It seems like, right, it gets 9-10 wins every year, but when they play Michigan, they play Ohio State, loss. In a 4-team format, I would not expect him to make the college football playoff. But if he doesn't make it in a 12-team format, I don't know how Penn State and Pat Kraft continue to employ James Franklin after this season.
It feels like a very pivotal, you got to make it into the postseason type situation. But the question that I get to now is, if you make it to the 12-team playoff, are we really satisfied if they go out in the first round or they win a first round game and then get blown out in the second round? Because it feels like it's the same spot that they were in the previous 2 years. It's just the idea that the playoff field was expanded. And I don't know. I mean, I like Drew Aller. I have questions about him. I don't think he's going to be throwing to a very good wide receiver room. And I hope that somebody in there surprises me. But just from what I'm seeing right now, I don't think it's really it. I like the defense a ton. I like Tom Allen calling the defense. There are going to be questions about this team. I do think they're talented. I do think it's a bit of a window for them to try to win.
Good
but
schedule,
I don't feel as confident.
It's a favorable schedule for them.
Yeah, but it doesn't feel as confident as when we talk about Ohio State, even with some of the questions we just talked about Oregon. I think Penn State is kind of on that next rung when we're talking about where I feel confidence in those teams.
Well, let me ask you this. So I agree with you. I think in the Big Ten for this year, it's Ohio State 1, Oregon 2. That third spot, do you put Penn State in that third spot, or do you think it's Michigan?
No, I'm putting Penn State in that third spot. It's Ohio State, Oregon, and then a little bit of a gap. Not a big gap, but a little gap. Then it's going to be Penn State. I'm putting Michigan right below that. And then I would probably fit Iowa in there, and they've got the benefit of having a fantastic schedule, right? Like, I wouldn't be shocked if we look up at the end of the year, and their record is very similar to what it was a year ago.
I look at Nebraska, and I think they're going to make a bowl game for the first time since 2016. I see them being 8-4. Well, I'm assuming they're starting Raiola week 1.
Yep.
But Rule in year 2 usually gets his teams bowl eligible. What are your thoughts on the Cornhuskers entering this season?
Totally agree. I think that's going to be it. And what we saw from Raiola in the spring, he looked more comfortable than a true freshman incoming in the spring would typically look. That's got to translate, and I know that is way easier said than done. I also don't think Tony White gets enough credit as a defensive coordinator. I think he's one of the best in the country, and Nebraska defensively played well all of last year. They've got the opportunity, I think, to be 7-0 when they play Ohio State as well, right? Like, you look at the way their schedule builds, there are going to be some challenges, and I'm not saying that these are all layups for them, but I think all of the games are going to be matchup opponents until they get to Ohio State. The back half of that schedule, now you're looking at some where you feel like they could lose some games. But if they can parlay momentum heading into the back half of that schedule, I think it's going to be huge for them.
And I think Raiola will be better than just average, let me be clear. But if they just had average QB play or just protected the football last year, they would have easily been a bowl team.
God. I mean, the turnover issue, right? And I agree with you. Like, you even take away half of the turnovers from last year. It's a much
you win
better
7 or 8
team.
games.
Yeah.
It's crazy. All right, wrap it up with Josh Perry right now. Let's go back to Michigan. What's a successful season this year realistically for Sharon Moore?
Oh man, that's a bit of a loaded question. First off, I think Sharon's a really good ball coach. I have no idea, man. Like they are one of the biggest question marks to me. And like I even mentioned what they're doing with their quarterback depth chart. Like I don't think any of us would be shocked if they already knew who their starting quarterback would be, and they're just doing that charade just to try to fool all of us and like throw us off the scent and create this mentality that nobody believes in them the same way they did a year ago, right? Like I think that's something that they thrive in. I think they should be a 9-win team, right? I think people have said anywhere between 8 and 10 wins. I would split the difference there. That Texas game early on, I think, is going to inform us of a ton. And then they've got a couple of the West Coast teams early in the schedule. I think USC and maybe Washington earlier on in the year. I think those will kind of give us a little bit of a window, because that with the West Coast teams, it'll tell me how good the defense is and if their offense will have enough to be able to maybe match points in one of those types of games.
You know who they kind of remind me of Ohio State last year, just without Marvin Harrison. Like defensively, we know they're going to be really damn good, but offensively, I just have no clue what to expect outside of probably their offensive line is going to be good.
Well, and I'll tell you this. I think Donovan Edwards is going to be a better player. I love Colston Loveland. He'll be the best tight end in the country, in my estimation. They're picking at quarterback. What they're deciding between is a guy who is safe and probably won't do a lot to lose them games in Jack Tuttle, but won't do a ton to win them games. And then Alex Orji is a guy who could do a ton to win them games, but the flip side of that is he could lose you some ball games too.
Is it kind of like Jalen Milroe-esque? Where with Alabama, where last year, like early on, it was like, they benched him. And then as the season did go on, they believed in him. And look how far Alabama did go last year.
I think it is. The thing that I struggle with, though, is like I felt like even coming out of high school, Orji was more of a project tape, right? He was a 48% completion guy in high school, which is crazy. Like Milroe was, 60 some odd percent, 4-star guy. Super raw in terms of what he was going to do, but I don't think it was as much of a project. And I think that's where I get the trepidation about Orji. Is definitely a project guy.
All right, before we let you run, let me hit on 2 more brands, big brands here, Josh Perry. Lincoln Riley at USC and Luke Fickell now, you're number 2 at Wisconsin. What are you expecting from the Badgers and also the Trojans here?
Well, I'll start with the Trojans. It was unique because everybody asked the question, well, what about your defense? And are you guys going to be tough enough in the trenches? Can you play? And I think Lincoln Riley is fully aware of what he's coming into playing in the Big Ten. I think the defense is going to get better under Danton Lynn. I know him personally. He was an assistant linebacker coach when I was playing for the Chargers. I think he's a sharp dude. I think they've got good enough personnel. Offensively, they'll be able to put up points. So I'm not worried about their transition as much. They just got to make sure that they can figure out ways to create depth in the trenches. Wisconsin is an interesting one to me, and I had a conversation with Luke Fickell at Media Days, and I'm very close with him. But I asked him, how are your guys? And he kind of knew what I was getting at. And he said last year, toward the end of the season, there was a transformation that had to happen in his locker room that started to take effect, where the players finally started to say enough is enough. There's an old way that they used to do things where, they knew what Wisconsin was in the larger scheme of college football. And I think they were okay with that understanding. And I think Luke is now trying to get those guys to say, we don't have to just be a team that's consistently good. We're allowed to be great as well. And toward the end of the year, I think the players, it started to take a toll on them. And they finally realized that we have to change our habits to be great. I'm curious to see what that looks like now, right? Like after a full off season of having that understanding as a locker room, can they actually go out there and start to take those next steps on the field?